Gerald, you were famous for collecting arrowheads. Do you have any particular memories of how you got started? Or?
Yes, this field to our right is where my arrowhead collecting took place. When they'd plow the field, it had to be plowed up before you could find the arrowhead. Just walking through the field now, you can't find them. But when my dad raised a garden to our right in this field, and it would turn the soil up, and then it helped if it came a rain and rained on it, and that would reveal the arrowheads. But as far as just walking through the field now, you probably wouldn't find any. The soil had to be turned up. I was probably about 15, I guess, 14 or 15 when I got into collecting arrowheads. And another field in the area that still is famous for arrowheads is Richard Morgan's field over on the old Barnesville Highway. They called it the Horseshoe Curve, and he used to raise tobacco in that field, and when he would turn the soil, and people would descend on that field and collect all of his arrowheads without permission. Yeah, his field really was more famous for arrowheads than this field was. I sort of kept this one secret. I didn't let the secret out. Well, I purchased some from some of my guys I went to school with. I found 15 or 20 that I found myself. Oh, sure, yeah, I've got them I have them in the lock box at the bank. Well, I remember we moved here, I guess in the fall of the year, and we didn't count on how open the house would be to the elements, and it got really cold. The house had a fireplace in every room, and we had a coal heater, and the road up to this house was such bad shape, a vehicle could only get up part of the way, and Dad had a horse and a sled, and he hauled coal up on the sled. We had a coal heater, and we didn't survive that winter. We moved back to Beatree that winter because it got so cold in the house, and then we moved back the next summer. I think that's when Dad started on the building the new house, and we toughed it out till he got the house built, and we moved into it then. I remember one thing about the old house. It was a well-built house, and a lot of money was invested in it, but they that built the house never painted the house, and I guess that's one reason it deteriorated so bad on the outside. Yeah, he didn't do a whole lot to it. Wasn't a whole lot he could do to it, but what he did do wasn't very successful. But I think he sort of gave up on. I think his plan was to remodel the old house, but it was far gone that he couldn't. He saw it was fruitless. One thing about the field behind, in front of me, I remember when we first moved here, that was a cleared field all the way to the top of the mountain, had wheat growing in it. And it's hard to believe that now by looking at it now and see all the trees that are in it. That at one time, that was even where this house in front of me was a cleared off field, and that's where they raised tobacco, and they had a wheat growing all the way to the top of the mountain. And they harvested it by hand, cradled it.
Can you talk a little bit about the water system as it evolved here?
Yeah, the spring was probably a quarter of a mile up on the mountain, and it ran. It was already piped down to the house. It ran outside, ran all the time in a pipe outside the old house. And then when we built the new house, Dad piped it on down to the new house, and we used that spring for a long time, and he had problems with it, the line clogging up, and that's when he finally drilled a well.
Do you remember anything about the reservoir that he made?
Yes, I do. It was out past the barns up to my left, and he built that reservoir out of concrete blocks in other words, it wouldn't have enough pressure to push it down to the new house, so he built that reservoir to give it pressure to push it on down to the house. And I remember one thing about, he had a horse and all the horse-drawn equipment, and he told me never get the horse out while he was going to work. But the temptation was too great, so one day I got the horse out and I hooked it to the sled, and this horse had a tendency to, if something slid and hit her heels, she'd take off running. So I had the sled, and And I let the sled run up and hit her heels. I was coming down the hill with it, and it hit her heels. And she ran through the barn, tore the sled all to pieces into splinters, and tore the harness up. And it was sort of hard for me to cover that up. But Dad was pretty angry the next morning after he got home from work and found out what I'd done with his horse and sled.
So how long did you stick with the sled before you decided better?
Not very long. I bailed off pretty quick. I can remember one other instance about here that we had a tobacco field on the hill above the barn here, and he had leased it out to Kennard Wallen to raise it. And Kennard came over one afternoon. We had an old Jeep, a 47 model Jeep, and one of two or three that I think Dad owned. And Kennard talked me into letting him hook one of the, seemed like it was the har or something behind that Jeep instead of using the horse. Or it might have been partly my idea too, but and Dad came in from work that night. I think he worked the second shift, and next morning he saw his Jeep had been out in the field with all the dirt and everything on it, and I got in pretty big trouble for that. Mostly verbal problems, and on the mountain behind the house, you go up the top of the mountain and you can see the Asheville Speedway from there. And every Sunday when they was having a race, me and my cousin Dale Rector, we'd hike up to the top of that mountain and come down on Gentry Branch side. There was a cleared field on top of that mountain at that time, an old apple orchard. And we'd take binoculars and sit there and watch the race. You know, we thought we were really cool watching the race without having to pay, but it was sort of like ants running around on the ground. It was so far away.
Even with the binoculars?
Yeah.
That's great.
But we could see the movement, you know, so.
Talk a little bit about your career as a squirrel hunter.
Well, what was amazing, back at that time, me and some of the guys, the friends that I have now, were talking about at that time. It's hard to believe, but when squirrel season came in, if we were going to go hunting with some of our friends, we'd take our guns on the bus to school, and they'd let us out early to go squirrel hunting. So could you imagine that now? A kid can't even carry a pocket knife to school, but that was a standard procedure at that time. And yet we'd usually get out early on the day of squirrel season and go with our friends and go squirrel hunting.
I remember a lot of talk from Mother maybe, about how many squirrels.
Quite a few, yeah. And she'd cook them and crack the skull and get the brains out. That was a delicacy, the squirrel brains.
That added a lot to our diet, actually.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we didn't.
Especially since I was such a great supplier of squirrels.
I remember some number like 28 one season.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Of course, that was a shot with a shotgun. That wasn't a 22. I know it was really a big event when we got to move into the new house.
I know you had a big role about the toilet, outdoor toilet.
I was elected to dig the hole, and I can't remember why my brother Dwight and Hoyt wasn't involved with that operation, but I got elected to dig the hole, and I was getting down pretty deep, and I had a mattock, and I was digging on the wall, and it bounced back and hit me. The sharp point hit me between the eyes, and I thought I was bleeding to death, blood streaming down my face. And I think somebody called their neighbor Shelby Jones or Dorothy one, and it was Shelby. I believe it was Dorothy. And she took me to the doctor. And you know, naturally, you get a scratch on your skull, and you think you're bleeding to death. I had blood running down my eyes, and I thought I was on the way out. I thought I was checking out, but it was just a minor, I don't know if it even took maybe a stitch at all, maybe one stitch. Yeah.